First, I want to thank the Forum and Peking University Economics Department for asking me to come present here. Secondly, I was very interested when I got this book to see the page announcing the topic of my talk, because I had never seen this topic before, but it looks very interesting, and I think I should write a paper on it someday. But I'm actually going to be speaking about something different, which did present its own problems with respect to the title, because I'm sitting in California in Berkeley, and I'm asked to write about something to do with the One Belt, One Road initiative, and I didn't know anything about this, so I made some inquiries, and it seemed like I wasn't really understanding what was being communicated clearly about it. But in the last few days, I realized I was not the only person who didn't really understand it. But I attempted to at least meet some of the requirements of the conference and these sessions in what I say today. So let me find where the PowerPoint symbol is in here. So I guess slideshow from beginning. Okay, so the title of my talk is Some Economic Threads for the New Silk Road. And that's what I'll talk about. Some other time, if you invite me back, I will talk about Towards a New Paradigm of Innovation Economics. I do work in innovation, and I think it would be fascinating, at least for me, to hear my own talk. So, obviously, the New Silk Road is part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. And even though I'm an economist, I'm clever enough to realize it's really a metaphor. It's a metaphor for recalling one of the great disruptive connections in the history of civilization. I think it signals an intention to hasten and deepen integration and development of countries in the heart of Asia and across Europe. Its political, cultural, and social significance might well dominate its economic ambitions, and how it will evolve is no doubt very difficult to predict right now, although this conference, I think, is quite enlightening on this topic. By the way, last time I visited China, I spent the last week in Xinjiang, and I traveled all over North Xinjiang and up to Kanas, and I got to realize the diversity, the cultural diversity of that part of China through which the Silk Road runs. And I do hope the road leads to cultural development and integration and respect for the unique cultural diversity of those regions and the regions further west. But even though it's a metaphor, I'm an economist, and generally speaking, economists don't do metaphors. We're literal people. So I'm going to talk instead about roads and the role of roads in an economy, what they do, what they don't do. Luckily, just right now is a time when economists are making a lot of progress in studying roads in meaningful ways. Until recently, regional science has been kind of a stepchild of economics because it's so hard to say anything about what roads do. But we're making some progress, and naturally, because the topic is a fairly new topic empirically, the answers are quite diverse, as you will see. The kinds of roads I'm talking about are long roads connecting markets previously separated by high transport costs. So I'm not talking about roads inside a city or something like that. I'm talking about the kinds of long roads that an Australian would think about. And they certainly are appropriate for the country that will be traversed by the Silk Road. Now, I'm not a transport economist, but I have had some interest in spatial separation of markets and spatial temporal integration of markets. And I view roads as creating possibilities for arbitrage. And by roads, I mean not just actual roads for cars and trucks, but also railroads, or what they call railways in some parts of the world. So what new roads can do? New roads are a spatial innovation. So is a road with a much lower transport cost because of great improvement, for example. It's one new option in a large ecosystem of arbitrage in general in a complex economy. Arbitrage involving the reallocation of goods and services in space, in time, and in other dimensions. A major road project therefore disrupts markets, and we just saw in the previous presentation some of that. It reconfigures them, it reorganizes them, it destroys some markets, it creates other markets. The road creates new possibilities, not all of which can be foreseen. New roads play favourites. So the effects of roads are complex and difficult to measure in an advanced economy. In modern economies, goods and services can in principle be distinguished among many different dimensions, such as time, space, quality, novelty, reliability. And there are many different kinds of spatial and temporal activities involved. So I'm going to start by simplifying the environment down to its basics, by starting with a stylized subsistence economy. In a peasant economy, individual peasants locally produced food and consumption restricted to the local area in general. Subsistence foods are heavy in value, and unless there's water transport around, spatial arbitrage is quite limited. Some of you are probably familiar in past centuries of people dying in one village when 2 or 3 days walk away there are people who are quite well nourished. So the plan of my talk will be to briefly consider the subsistence autarky and then make the analogy with the global grain economy, which is also in a way a subsistence economy because you can't borrow from other planets, you've got to eat what you have and no more. I'll talk about the potential for one kind of arbitrage that exists even in a village, and that's the arbitrage intertemporally by storage, which is something I've studied for quite a while, with the motive of increasing consumption security by levelling out the vagaries of the environment, mostly the production environment and the vagaries of weather or disease. And then I'll move on to some recent economic studies of the type that I alluded to in my introduction. And these studies use very different approaches and they focus on different issues, but they're all quite enlightening. So let's start with the subsistence economy. Peasants eat what they grow. Arbitrage occurs only within the village economy. There's some arbitrage available. You can eat your harvest. You can keep some of it to sow the next period if you want to eat the next period. You can store some for later consumption. Other types of arbitrage are also possible, arbitrage between work and leisure. And intra-village smoothing, arbitrage between families can be very important in village economies to protect individual members of the village from family disasters of one kind or another. My colleague Ethan Ligon at Berkeley has studied this along with Thomas and Worrell from England. Now let's consider calorie consumption in autarky. Recent work that's been done by Robertson Schlenker and others shows that there's really a very high fundamental substitutability between the major grains, which are the major source of calories for humankind. So I'm going to speak as if they're the only source of calories, just to keep things simple. Populations can't eat more than what's available. If there's more than enough available, they can store some. But if you're talking about an individual subsistence village or the whole world, you can't borrow and eat more than what you have available from production. You can save some for the future, and that's a fundamental non-linearity that makes the problem somewhat more complex. But as I said, the world is a calorie autarky. So I'm going to assume just the major grains. I'm going to count the calories from them, and I'm going to assume they're perfect substitutes. Weather shocks are the only shocks I'll assume where necessary. But still, in that autarky, you can arbitrage across time. Does that kind of arbitrage make much difference in fact? Well, to answer this question, I'll answer the question in the context of the autarky where I know what the numbers are to some extent, and that's the global grain production autarky, not the village one. If it does make a difference, if it doesn't make a difference, then each year consumption must approximately match production. And so you expect bad harvests to be reflected in high prices. And some of you have probably heard claims that in 2007, 2008 and later, the price spikes that we saw in those years were caused by global warming affecting production, reducing production so much that people had to consume less, and that caused the high prices. How many people have heard this story? I heard this case eloquently made by a member of the Royal Society a couple of years ago. Okay, so let's see if this is true. So the red line here is last year's production level for maize, wheat, and rice. The wheat is the purplish one, the maize is the light blue one, and rice is the yellowish one. And so let's see where the risky production has been. Well, let me tell you, this covers the years of the early 1970s when there were huge price spikes, the biggest we've seen is certainly in post-war history. So can anybody in the audience tell me where the early 1970s are on this picture? Well, if the theory is true, then they should be where there's a big production shortfall. That means, compared to last year, a big drop in production of something, right? There are a couple there. Nobody seems to be volunteering, so I'll show you where it is. Right there. This was the biggest price spike in recent history in those years between 73 and 75. Okay, so, and then you can also look across here and see that enormous drop in availability of maize, which caused a large drop in availability of calories in that memorable year of 1983, which nobody remembers at all because it didn't cause a high price increase. And look at the right-hand side of the diagram and see the disaster caused by global warming. Big shortfalls from production, where are they? In most of the crops you had increases in most of those years. So no evidence of production disasters at all, despite what you hear on the radio, which is actually very disappointing for me because Australia hardly gets mentioned, but Australian drought got mentioned a lot then, and we were pretty famous for having messed up the whole world's grain economy. But it's not evident in this graph. Okay, so here's another picture here, and I'm relieved to see that this shows up pretty well, I think, on those screens. This is an index of global price versus an index of world production, and this is calories. So it's an index of the price of calories weighted by the quantities. We've drawn two trends through these data. And the trends, there's two of them because one trend stops in 2005 because in 2006, 5 and 6, there was the start of the real cause of the recent price increases, the jumps, and that was the institution of new biofuels policy in the United States and Europe, including mandates out many years for greater consumption of calories. You don't hear as much about this because farmers don't want you to think that this is the reason the prices rose. And also, this is a very clever way, incidentally, I'm not going to talk about this, of distorting trade in your favor without stopping you going around the world lecturing other people about how they should have open borders. A very clever plan, which raised farmers' incomes tremendously in the United States and Australia and Europe. But I'm going to talk about mostly the first trends up until 2005. And I'm going to take away the trends, so I'm just going to show the deviations from those numbers. And let's see if I can get this to work. Here we are. This is detrended production against detrended price. And you'll notice here that the detrended production in blue doesn't really seem to be well coordinated with the detrended prices at all. You'd expect production to be low when prices are high. Well, in the early 1970s that was true, although we can't get too excited because you've seen that the production fall wasn't that big. And certainly recently there doesn't seem to have been that kind of coordination. In fact, you can see it, I don't have a laser pointer unfortunately, but there's a period there where actually production and price were both following the same line for a number of years. So now let's instead relate price to the ratio of stocks to consumption. So the amount you're storing related to the amount of consumption. That's a good indicator of the tightness of the market and whether you really have enough stocks around to cushion that market. So this is the detrended price against just the stocks to use ratio. And now I think if you want to make a case that prices are high when stocks to use are low, I think you can make a pretty good case from this picture. Okay? Talking about the whole picture, but especially the part before the advent of biofuels, because the advent of biofuels meant you had prices and production rising at the same time in response to a permanent demand increase, which makes sense. So arbitrage in the global economy really does work to moderate prices. And it's only when you have stocks so low that arbitrage can't work anymore that you tend to get really high prices. Okay, so now let's think about Africa. Africa is a place, I talked about a global autarky, but Africa really isn't in that global grain market because transport costs within Africa are so high. And here's a demonstration of that fact. If you think of the continental United States, New Orleans, Memphis, and Minneapolis are all on the same transport route, but very different parts of the continent. You notice those prices tracking each other so well on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you have Africa. You have 2 places in Kenya and 2 places in Tanzania. We have some high production areas, some production lacking areas. And you notice the enormous difference in prices between those different places, and they're not even moving in the same direction some of the time, especially towards the right. So obviously there's something blocking arbitrage even within that small part of Africa, really drastically blocking it. And part of the reason is road transport, which is necessary to move things around those areas. Road transport is difficult and costly. And I have a student, Obi Porteous, who's done a study of Africa, and we'll come to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about a couple of Chinese roads. The first one is the Xinjiang Railroad. Sorry, my Chinese is not good, but it's the section from Goma to Lhasa. It was completed in 2006. And it was studied by Wang and Wu in a paper recently published in Economic Development and Cultural Change. And what they're talking about is that part of the railroad down there in the left-hand side. And they did a study, and they claimed, first of all, that the placement of the railroad was just on technical grounds, not related to the needs of the local counties, which was important for identification purposes. And they claimed that their result was that the railroad increased the GDP of the counties that it went through by 33% relative to having no railroad. Mainly due to increased industrialization in those counties between the cities being connected. They admit that this is probably a high figure because we know there are other things going on in transfers to that part of the world besides just making a railroad. But that was an interesting contribution to the study of railroads, and in a very interesting case. And it was one reason it's interesting because it was connecting a relatively undeveloped and simple kind of economy to a larger Chinese economy. Now another case is a case by a German economist, Faber, who actually now has joined the faculty in Berkeley. And he studies the national highway transport system in China. And he uses a calculation of the transport system was designed, as I understand it, to connect all major cities in China, I think cities more than 500,000 population. So he used as an instrument for that because he's worried about the fact you might tend to put the highway in the areas which you think are going to be growing fastest, so you'll be biasing your results. So he programmed the least cost transport network between these cities and came up with this map. The red is the highway system as it was built by 2007, and the black was the least cost network. Now, there are some things about this instrument I don't particularly like it's certainly a long way from the center of the southeast back up to the top if you're going to take the black network. So I'm not sure that this instrument is really ideal, but I think it's a very creative effort. And what he finds is that the highways in this case reduce the industrialization of the counties they went through relative to the counties where the road didn't go through. So basically this fits Krugman's theory of agglomeration, which says that if you've got increasing returns to scale and you reduce transport costs enough, then you'll get concentration of economic activity where most of the consumers are, in the cities. And so you'll clean out the local areas. He also claims there is no evidence of large population reallocation at this time. I wonder about that because I wonder if some of that reallocation was informal and not well measured. And one reason I wonder is because the previous study showed that, in fact, there was no effect of the railroad to Lhasa where there were no passenger stations. It's only in the passenger stations you had this effect. Okay, now the African road studies, Africa's like China in some ways, large landmass, long distance, unlike many countries, not just one. So Storeygard uses, and the previous speaker stole my thunder, city lights as an indication of economic activity, uses petroleum prices as a proxy for transport costs, and looks at Tanzania, for example, and other countries in Africa. But here's an example. Dar es Salaam is in that little red circle there, and the satellite can measure the intensity of the lights, and he looks at the intensity of the lights between 2002 and 2008, and that's Dar es Salaam under magnification. And he used maps, GIS information, etc., calculates least cost routes, and assumes that the petroleum price increase in 2002-2008 is a good measure of the costs in Africa. And this is the least cost road network to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, for example. And he claims that for every 500 kilometers further from the port, the growth of those cities far from the port was retarded by 7% relative to the port cities between 2002 2008 because of high petroleum costs. Now, the final one, I want to skip over the rest of this because I do want to get to Porteous' study. Porteous did a study of 230 sub-Saharan markets, 413 direct links between them, monthly prices for each market from several sources. You can now understand that he spent quite a while in Africa. This is the map of his transportation network. He allocated all those cities to catchment areas using GIS grid cell data on production, GIS data on topography, calculating yield catchment areas based on the fastest distance, fastest travel, and he got this map here. So the bright areas, the bright yellow, are the pixels which have a smaller travel time to their local catchment market, and the darker areas a larger travel time, and these are the catchment areas. Given those catchment areas, he estimates the trade costs between markets. He also has a storage model to allocate storage locally when there's very high trade costs. He finds from the price data, he estimates that African trade costs on average are 5 times world benchmarks, both within Africa and for sea transport. The disaggregated trade costs between cities, he does regression analysis and finds they're not mostly petroleum costs. They're related to lower road quality, of course, international borders, of course, absence of regional trade agreements, lower scores on Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, lower scores on World Bank Logistics Performance Index. He then does a counterfactual analysis, and he looks at, see on the top there you have the counterfactuals. The first one is current trade costs and then world trade costs. So that's looking down the first column. Average grain price falls by 46% if you lower the trade costs within Africa to world benchmark levels. Net grains exports reduced, you get more imports, and welfare increases 2%. Then, if instead you keep the current trade costs, but you double the harvest by innovation, is this good for farmers? Prices fall by 58%, revenues fall by 71%. A couple of countries tried that experiment. Double yields and see what happens. You go bankrupt if you're a commercial farmer. But welfare increases by 2.6% because consumers are better off. Third one is you start with lower trades costs and you double harvest, then things aren't so bad starting from having already had those trade costs. Your revenue goes up from there by 12%, big increase in exports. The final one is you do the trade costs lowering and the harvests, and now you still get a lowering of revenues on average, but not so big. And it's very heterogeneous. Many areas the farmers gain, some areas they lose. Consumers gain a lot, 4.4%. And this is just from grain. I'm abstracting from every other gain from the road. But you can see that some people are gaining, some people are losing from this big road scheme. He also shows that you can do about 75% or 80% as well just by concentrating on a small subset of those main routes in getting trade costs down. So the implications are, as I said, trade plays favourites. Transport cost reduction favours high productivity farmers in the hinterland, hurts low productivity farms, raises aggregate welfare and consumers gain, and it possibly makes yield-enhancing innovation politically feasible because it doesn't destroy most of the farmers in Africa by reducing their revenues. So the conclusions, I also wanted to talk more about the dynamics of these maps. I've got other work based on some earlier work I did showing that once you introduce dynamics and the need to deliver things quickly, that all those maps get radically distorted, and most of the transportation facilities you think you have become useless. I'd be happy to talk with you about that later on. But for now, I'll just stick to these conclusions. There are conflicting conclusions on the sign of the welfare effects, because if you've been concentrating, you'll notice that the first study of the Lhasa Railroad showed a big gain. Faber showed a big loss from reducing rail costs. Storeygard showed a big gain from increasing transport costs, so a loss from reducing transport costs. And and also you have differential effects by region, overall welfare gain from specialisation. So what do roads do? A road complements some market activities, such as specialised production, substitutes for others, for example, subsistence production. A road plays favourites.